Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of The Tango Banter. I am Yelizaveta, and as always, it is a pleasure and an honor to spend the next few moments with you wherever you are. I am continuing my banter on the topic of marathons today, and in today's episode, we're going to talk more about the physical aspect of marathons and how to ensure that you have the amount of energy and physical stamina needed to not only survive a marathon or a festival, but to possibly even thrive. Although, with even doing all of the things that I might suggest, you still will find that it is quite a feat physically to go into an event like that and come out of it without any long-lasting effects, because typically there are post-marathon, post-festival blues that take over for different reasons. And so we'll talk about that today, and I will share with you some things I've learned about my body over the years, and I invite you to perhaps share with me some of your insights about your experience. What are the tools and approaches to your physical well-being have helped you to make the festival and marathon experience more successful for you? So, as always, I love hearing from you, so you can reach out to me on social media at I'm So Tango, or contact me by email at connect@imsotango.com. And I guess I'll take this moment also to recognize that for many of you, you've been listening to me for a while, and you've noticed that a lot of the themes I'm touching upon, I share my perspective as a woman, because that's what I can speak from with more confidence. But some of you are not women, and I've been hearing from many male dancers who tell me that they find this content helpful even though they're not women, that the themes that I'm touching upon, the emotional struggles, the psychological difficulties, that resonates also for men. And to that extent, I want to encourage you to share with me your experience as a man, because a lot of times I just don't get to hear that perspective, or I don't get to talk in depth with a lot of the male friends I have at the Milonga, so I'm not necessarily aware how it is for the men in the community. So I would love to hear more from you guys, the men in the outer, in that space out there, and I hope that you continue to feel encouraged and inspired by what I'm sharing. So when it comes to physical endurance and physical well-being and tango, over the years there's been many conversations and debates about the sort of the negative impact of tango, because the lifestyle of a typical tango dancer is not very normal. And I was very much into that lifestyle. In fact, I spent many years living that lifestyle. And the basic structure of the lifestyle is that you stay up all night dancing, and then you sleep for half the day and you get up and do it all over again. And that's basically, if you go to Buenos Aires, that is a very typical experience. And when I went to Buenos Aires for the first time, I was a younger person. And I didn't really care as much about pushing my body to its extreme limits. So I did that for many, many months. The first time, or actually the second time I went there, that's when I stayed there for about 6.5 months. And I danced pretty much every night of the week. Maybe I would take 1 or 2 days off a week, and I would just dance until anywhere from 4 a.m. until 6 a.m. And it really did take a toll on my body over time. And I noticed there was some psychological impact as well, because there was something very disorienting about going to bed when it's light out. So I remember the last time I was in Buenos Aires, I had this deal with myself that I just needed to be in bed before the sun came up. So I would leave the milonga. I kind of knew when the sun was coming up. I would leave the milonga and I would rush home. And the moment I'd get home, I'd close the curtains. And it would start getting light, but I'd close the curtains and just go to bed as soon as possible. And that really helped. But I really started acknowledging how, I guess I want to say abusive almost. It can be pretty rigorous to subject yourself to that kind of schedule. And one sentiment I've been hearing a lot since the pandemic ended is that for many dancers post-COVID, we sort of lost our ability to do that, and we don't really want to do that anymore, that we want to keep our normal sleep schedule. And I know some of this also is age-related. As we get older, we get more particular about our sleep cycles. I know I have become very particular about it. But also I think it has to do with the overall experience that you've had in tango. So for people who are just coming in and starting tango, there might be that feverish desire to just dance as much as possible no matter what. And so this passion sort of takes over, and you can dance all night and then sleep for a few hours and then do it all over again, and maybe dance at multiple milongas. But then with time, as you dance more and more and you get your fill, that might shift. So when it comes to marathons and festivals, it's sort of this little injection of that lifestyle where for 3 or 4 days you become part of this sort of demanding physical experience. And the way I think of it these days is that social tango is a lot more like a sport versus an art. And more specifically, I think of it as that social tango in particular, not stage tango or performance tango, but social tango is like an endurance contact sport, that it requires a lot of stamina, and that if you want to do well in it, it serves you to approach it the way an athlete would approach an upcoming race. And that's kind of what I had to do, because I started noticing a huge impact on my dancing when I didn't respect the limitations of my body. And so some of the stuff I'm going to talk about is going to be very personal to me, but some things I think you'll recognize in yourself as well. So if we think about this idea that tango is a sport, a contact sport, let's then think about what are some of the things that will impact an athlete's performance. And the first one, and the one that is sacrificed the most, of course, is sleep. Tango marathons in particular are famous for having all-nighters, which means you dance until 5 or 6 a.m. And there is a little bit of, at least for me, I know there was a bit of this desire to have this moment of making it to the end. Like it's a point of pride that you survived until the end. And I remember my very first all-nighter that I was able to actually complete was at Seattle Tango Magic a number of years ago. And it was a big deal to walk out when the sun was rising. It was really exciting to me. So sleep is the first thing to go. And this is where the first set of choices is presented to us as dancers, because if you're a night owl by nature and it doesn't bother you to not have a lot of sleep, it might not be a big deal. But I've noticed that for most of us, there is an impact. And for me, if I'm not careful and I don't get enough sleep or don't get enough quality sleep one night, then the rest of the event has quite a bit of difference for me. It really impacts my dancing. It makes me more irritable. It reduces my excitement about the dance, and it makes me more critical and cranky overall, and I just don't get to feel that flow state that we really want to feel as dancers. So there's no way around it. There's definitely going to be a sacrifice of sleep unless you don't go to night events at all, or you leave, early on in the night around midnight, which is totally possible. And I sort of been thinking about that for myself, that I might, as I continue to dance, choose to shift my focus on dancing during the day and maybe early in the night, and not necessarily push myself to stay up all night. But then I also have noticed, for me, there's a sweet spot, and this is where I invite you to reflect on your own body. And there is sort of a threshold, I would say, for me, that as long as I get to sleep by 3 a.m., that I'm able to not feel too disoriented the next day. And for me, I absolutely have to get a certain number of hours of sleep. I don't function very well on anything less than 7 hours. 7.5 or 8 is ideal, but 7 hours is my requirement. I could possibly do it one night on 6 hours, but I don't want to. So for me, if I go to sleep at 3 a.m., I can wake up at 10 a.m. and sort of feel okay. But beyond that, it starts to kind of cut into my feeling of okayness. If I can go to bed a little bit earlier, that's even better. But, sometimes it's a really nice night and you're having a good time and you just kind of want to keep going. So I recently had an experience at a marathon where I stayed up until 4 or 5, and then I woke up around 11 a.m. or 11:30, And then the next Milonga I was at, I was there by like 1:30 in the afternoon. And I tell you, I had the worst time. It was so difficult. I was so tired and I was so angry that I was tired. And there was nothing I could do at that point. There was no amount of coffee I could have had or food. I just really needed sleep. So my recommendation for all dancers is to be really particular about your sleep from the very beginning and go in with a lot of intentionality. Sometimes you need to make sure that you can black out your space so you can sleep fully and well until you wake up, because the light that comes in actually really impacts your body. Even if you're asleep, it really impacts your nervous system and starts to trigger your body to wake up. So cutting out all light and having the space very quiet and trying to sleep for as long as you can so you wake up with an alarm is probably the best case scenario. Now, once you wake up, I don't know, I'm curious how everybody else feels, but these days I'm an early riser. I'm up by 7:30 in the morning. I feel very different when I wake up at 11 a.m. and I feel very groggy and my body feels very dry. A lot of times I feel sort of like all of the moisture has been pulled out of my muscles and I just feel like I'm Tin Man or something. So this kind of leads me into this next point, is that it's really important to introduce some sort of a movement practice in between milongas that can help hydrate and lubricate your body. If you haven't noticed, tango is extremely asymmetrical. Everything from the way our posture works, the way the embrace is constructed, and how we move on the dance floor. We spend more time on one side than the other. We turn more to one side than the other, and that continues for many hours. And it creates a lot of, points of tension in the body that you might not be aware of consciously because it doesn't, quote unquote, hurt. But the fact remains that because of the asymmetry, that's going to be there for sure. And in my many years of working with people with injuries and overcoming injuries or recovery from surgery or something like that, I've learned that it is the small impact injuries over a long period of time, those are the ones that cause more damage in the long run. So if you were to, let's say, break a bone, that is actually going to have less impact than if you were to have a habit of holding your alignment slightly off for many years. The latter is going to cause more problems and will be more difficult to heal later in life. So that principle is a really important one, and I hope you take it to heart, because I really believe that one of the keys to longevity in the body is to make sure that there's ample opportunity for your whole body to move in its full range of motion, or as full range of motion as you possibly can. So tango puts us into this very limited range of motion, and it ends up creating these little pockets of tension. So a practice that can help to unwind that is really key. So it could be something as traditional as yoga. It could be just stretching, anything that gets you on the ground and allows you to sort of feel yourself moving in different directions, and stretching and breathing is going to significantly improve your longevity through the event. And for me, it's literally impossible to continue if I don't do that. So that day I described to you when I had a really difficult time at the marathon, I was looking back on that morning, and I even said that I sacrificed my morning routine to go visit a friend that I hadn't seen in a long time, so I didn't get my movement in. I didn't take the time to do what I usually do and have a sort of a leisurely segment of self-care where I move and I eat my breakfast and whatever. And that really did a huge number on me the rest of the day. So sleep, number one, and number two, including some sort of movement practice that encourages you to connect with the breath and regain some of the more symmetrical aspects of your body. Although, I don't know about you, I have been permanently physically altered by tango. I have a little bit of misalignment in my upper spine. One of my shoulders is aligned differently from the other, and it's part of the game. You can't escape that. The asymmetry is just going to be there, but we need to do as much as we can to counteract the impact of that. Now, the next thing that is really important is what it is that you're actually taking into your body, the diet. And of course, this is where, there's a huge range. And most of the time, festivals and marathons, there's some good variety of food, but I think it tends to heavily cater to the sweet tooth that we have. And coffee and wine, and so alcohol, sugar, and caffeine. Sometimes there's some healthy options, but for the most part, I think the sugar and the alcohol are very prominent at these events. And I don't know if it's necessary to cut all of it out, but I do see a big impact on myself when I think of it as an athletic performance event, taking in sugar and alcohol and how that impacts how my body feels throughout the event. So I'm pretty radical when it comes to nutrition and diet. And when I go into marathons, most of the time it's actually my healthiest periods, because I don't drink alcohol and I don't eat sugar. I just make that a rule, no sugar. And that helps. That helps me to retain my energy. It doesn't disrupt my sleep. It doesn't disrupt my digestion. And I'll tell you that the no sugar thing, actually, I decided because there was a festival I was at, I think it was last year, and I went in, I think it was Saturday night, and I was having a great time, and they brought out this homemade cobbler, and I was so excited because I typically tend to not eat sugar anyway, but this time I was like, this is special. I'm going to have some cobbler. It's going to be amazing. And so here's this cobbler coming out, and I got myself a serving, and I sat down, and I'm just having the greatest time. I'm sitting there, I'm eating this cobbler. It's so delicious. I'm looking at the dance floor, and this is one of my first events post-COVID, so I'm really soaking it all in. And then not 10 minutes later, I just felt like there was a curtain that just sort of came down in front of me. And suddenly I was so tired and I was so cranky and I hated everything. So from that moment on, I really decided that I was not going to partake of any sugar during the event. And for the most part, I stick to that. Although the last event I went to, I ended up consuming quite a bit of sugar, and it helped because I was kind of in this state of, I don't care anymore. Like, I was already not having a good time because I was kind of cranky. So then the sugar actually helped. So sometimes, people swear by it. It gives them energy, and It's very potent. It's a potent drug, sugar. So I tend to be very cautious about my intake of it because I know that it can really impact me. So overall, those are the main things about the diet, is to just really watch the sugar and the alcohol. For me, I know a lot of people do really well with it. People enjoy drinking wine and then dancing. I don't do well. If I have it the next day, I'm really groggy and my body doesn't feel that great. So I tend to avoid it. But also, along with these things that we want to be careful about, you want to make sure your intake of water is on the higher end, right? Because just like any athlete, when you think of those athletes who are in the Tour de France, they're on their bikes for hours at a time, and as they're going, people hand them water bottles and they just squeeze some in their mouth and they keep going. I kind of think of it that way, that when you're dancing, especially if you know you're going to be dancing for many hours, it's very important that you continue drinking. And if you can drink something with electrolytes, not sugary, something that really kind of helps you stay hydrated, I think it really enhances your longevity throughout the event. So those are like the top 3 things that I feel are important to establish for yourself. So sleep, movement outside of tango, and then diet. I think those are the building blocks. Without them, nothing else you do is going to really help. But if you have at least those 3 things figured out for yourself, for your body, then there's some additional things that you want to consider that can help your body last longer. So the next thing I want to talk about is clothing, and that includes shoes. There's lots of variety for both, but I have noticed for myself, it makes a huge impact on my dance and my physical well-being, how my body feels. So let me give you some examples. In terms of clothing, there's lots of really great tango clothing, but for a long time I used to just kind of wear whatever I thought was good, and sometimes I would be hurting by the end of the night. So one thing that I've tried and I totally cannot do anymore is wearing something like a corset, or wearing something that is not stretchy, that the fabric is sort of fixed, and that if I were to try to take a deep breath in, that it would restrict me. And it might be clothing that I'm totally okay wearing when I'm not dancing, but when I am dancing, I've noticed that I really have to have full range of breathing space. I have to be able to breathe in deep at any moment. So that includes, for me, not wearing belts. And in fact, wearing belts is something I feel like it really makes us move differently. And frequently in the last few years, when I've tried to wear a belt, I end up having some lower back pain. So I'm curious if you've experienced this. I've talked to other people who have had, similar experiences, but clothing makes a big impact on how your body ends up moving. So choosing fabrics that are stretchy and that are breathable is really important. I mean, not to mention that some of the synthetic fabrics end up smelling when you add sweat to it. So it's like, I don't know if you've ever had that, but like you smell your shirt and you're like, oh yeah, it's okay. This shirt is fine. I just wore it once. But then you start sweating and then all of a sudden there's just this odor that rises out of your armpits. So choosing fabrics that are more natural, or if it's synthetic, that you kind of test it and you know that it's not going to smell. But stretchiness of the fabric, I think, is the most important, because it does impact your range of motion. It impacts the range of motion when you breathe. And if your breath is restricted in any way whatsoever, I cannot tell you, the impact is humongous. It's incredible how much less capable your body is when your breathing capacity is restricted even a little bit. I mean, honestly, I don't know how people wear corsets. I really don't understand how it's possible, because whenever I put something like that on, I end up having somewhat of a panic attack, because the feeling that I can't really stretch out my diaphragm and breathe in has like a psychological effect on me. So, in terms of the clothing, making sure that you're very comfortable. Prioritize comfort, even though we love to dress up and it's a festival and a lot of it is about like looking good and wearing the best outfit that you can. If you think of it as an athlete, someone who's involved in an endurance sport, you want to make sure that your body is comfortable and that you prioritize the physical aspect of your movement. So choosing clothing accordingly will make a big difference in the long run. So then we come to a discussion of shoes. And that's a big topic in itself, because I believe that shoes have probably one of the biggest impacts on your lower back, on your neck, on your knees. There's just so many things. It's like a domino effect. So if you have shoes that are not quite comfortable or don't support you in the right way, it can really impact your longevity, and you can end up in too much pain to go on. So one thing that I frequently point out to people is that you want to make sure that your shoes are not too narrow in the front, which is a challenge when you're wearing high heels. But if we're talking flats, I'd recommend a wide toe box shoe, as wide as you can have, to where you really feel that your toes can spread, and you don't have to feel that tightness at the front of the shoe. And when it comes to heels, this definitely reduces your longevity wearing heels 100% of the time. It does not matter the level of your experience. It doesn't matter your technique. You might have the best technique. It is a fact your feet are going to start hurting, and from there your knees, your lower back, and all of that. And eventually women are coming off the dance floor and they're just saying, I can't dance anymore because my feet hurt too badly. But heels look really nice and they're beautiful. They're just works of art sometimes, and you just don't want to give that up. And I totally get that. I gave it up because I decided I wanted to be able to dance all night, and I wanted to be able to dance without pain. So I gave up wearing heels a few years ago. And when I gave them up, it wasn't like I was planning on it, that I was never going to dance, right? I just gave them up saying to myself, let's just see how long I can get away without wearing heels. And that was it. I just thought, whenever I have to put them back on, I will. And I just never felt the need to put them back on. So I've danced in all sorts of shoes, both tango, like shoes that are made for tango, but I've also danced in casual shoes before I got my several $100 pair of tango shoes. I used to go I used to dance in my Toms shoes very often. And I've danced in sneakers as well, and I love dancing in sneakers. And I love dancing in my Toms, although they do get pretty ratty eventually because they're, just canvas, made out of canvas. So they get pretty nasty. And in addition to the shape of the shoe itself, you want to be considerate of the height of the heel, whether it is a flat, a leading shoe, or a heeled shoe for followers. The height of the heel matters a lot. And I've heard from leaders who would try on shoes that feel okay, but then, the heel would just be just a little extra not a high heel shoe, just a little bit of a heel in the back, and that it would start hurting eventually. So that does play a huge difference. So you want to make sure that you pay attention to those qualities, the shape of the shoe, the actual heel, the height of the heel, and then also the way your shoe is able to pivot, right? So we want shoes that can slide and pivot pretty easily, but sometimes either the floor or the shoe creates a little bit of extra friction. And I had an experience with this situation very early on in my dance, before I got my first pair of Comme il faut tango shoes. I just bought a pair from Target of high heels, and they just had a normal kind of rubber bottom, and I was able to pivot fine. But there was just a tiny bit of friction. So every time that I pivoted, it would do this like micro torque on my knee. Just the tiniest little movement there that prevented me from readily pivoting. And eventually, I actually had pain going from my knee to my hip on the outer edge of my thigh, so where the IT band is located. And it started pretty quickly. Like once I started dancing, after a few times of dancing in those shoes, I noticed every time I pivoted, it would hurt on the outer part of my thigh. And I had enough body awareness to identify what the issue was, and I ended up buying a real pair of tango shoes, and that problem went away. So I would recommend that you're very aware of the flexibility and the range of your shoe, that it really allows your foot to move with as much range of motion as possible. I mean, that's really the guiding principle of everything, is your body needs to distribute the effort. The more it can distribute the effort throughout the system, the less impact you'll feel in one area. It's going to be spread out. So when it comes to feet, your goal is to move the foot in its full range of motion as much as possible. It is more possible in a flat shoe than it is in the heel, but still, even in heels, you want to make sure that you're able to move the foot inside the shoe at least a little bit to articulate and to spread the load throughout the foot, and that really, really helps. With the heels for women too, I've noticed that sometimes women choose heels that are too tall for them, and it has nothing to do with being able to dance in a shoe that has, a really high heel. You could do it, but there's sort of another threshold there depending on your dimensions of your limbs, the length of your foot and the relationship between the foot and the shin bone. And so sometimes the heel can become a little bit too high, which will cause more tension throughout the system. Your body will be a little bit more tense throughout, which will again diminish your longevity in the event, because you're going to get that tension is going to eventually wear you out. So I do recommend that you test it out. Test out different heights of heel and really observe which height gives you the most ease, that you can walk and you can pivot easily without much effort. You can stay on your axis. You're not having to grip. Those are some of the key things to observe. And to that end, if you are a dancer who really loves to wear heels, but you also want longevity, I do recommend that you do buy yourself a pair of flats and just have it on standby. And those, that's a really functional way of approaching it if you want a little bit of both, because you can start out wearing heels, And then when it starts getting to that point where it hurts too much and you're not necessarily enjoying it as much, then you can switch to your flats. And yes, dancing in flats is different and does require technique. I've spoken about this many times, and I've done some videos on it. And in fact, I'll go ahead and include the link to a tutorial I did a while back on what are the major differences between dancing in flats versus dancing in heels, mechanically speaking. So, but when you have the right technique for dancing in flats, it's really amazing how much longer you can dance. Really, the big key, I'll give you the punchline. I'll give you the thing to pay attention to when you're dancing in flats. Don't dance on your toes. Okay, that's really the big deal, because a lot of people they'll say, well, I dance in heels better because when I dance in flats, it actually makes me feel less stable. And 99% of the time, it's because they're dancing on their toes, on their ball mound, and they're not letting the heel come down to the ground. And you really want the heel on the ground as much as possible, because that's how you're going to get the full range of motion in your foot. So I'm not going to go too much further into it because it's quite technical, but if you have more specific questions, I'm happy to talk to you about it, because I know for a lot of women, I've heard this sentiment that they want to transition to wearing flats, but they don't know the technique, and they are finding that it's actually harder to dance in flats than in heels. So I can definitely help you with that. The last point I'm going to share with you has to do more with the external conditions in the context that you're dancing with. So it's not something that you have a lot of control over, but it is really good to be aware of those things, because it can inform your decisions. So one of the biggest impacts that you're going to experience is from the quality of the actual dance floor. And I used to be one of those dancers who could just dance on anything. I didn't care. But at one point, a friend of mine was talking to me, and he pointed out that you really want to make sure you don't dance on concrete. Concrete is one of the worst things to dance on. And unfortunately, many of the venues that we dance in, they might have a hardwood floor, but it's actually on top of concrete. And the event that I was recently at, that was the case. So the venue was great, everything was beautiful, but the only thing, the floor underneath the wood was concrete. And I cannot tell you how many conversations I had with people who said their knees were hurting. And I can't even imagine what it was like for people in heels, because even dancing in flats and very comfortable shoes, I felt it. And I definitely dance less when I'm dancing on a concrete floor, because over time my knees start kind of aching a little bit, and just everything starts feeling a little bit, a little stiff. So I definitely appreciate the quality of the floor, and that's something that I consider when I'm deciding to go to an event. Actually, is a lot of times I'll check it out. I'll find out if the floor is concrete or wood on top of concrete. The best one is that kind of springy wooden floor that actually is layered on top of springs. That's really the creme de la creme of dance floors. And when I used to live in Portland, people would visit Portland from other places around the world, including Buenos Aires, and they would comment and said, wow, Portland is so lucky because we have so many floors, so many good dance floors there. All the venues had such great floors, and I didn't used to appreciate it. I took it for granted, but now it's very clear to me that the quality of the floor has an immense amount of impact on how I feel as a dancer. And to that end, there was an event that I was at last year that had an outdoor floor created by just taking some, like like a piece of linoleum, huge sheet of linoleum, and just putting it down onto the asphalt. And people were dancing on that floor, and I was just like, wow, it's like the worst floor you could be dancing on, seriously, because not only is it just no give in the floor, but also the linoleum surface is just a little sticky, just tiny bit of stickiness. Again, it creates that torque in the knees when you're pivoting, and that's really one of the worst things you can do for your body, is to dance on a floor like that. So what do you do about that? Well, you just have to be aware of it and decide. So I'm mentioning it specifically because sometimes you might jump to conclusions that you're hurting because you're getting old. And I've heard people say that. They're like, oh, I'm getting old, my knees really hurt. And I'm like, that's not you, that's the floor. Like, my knees are hurting too. So it's good to be aware of those things, because you can do something about it for yourself, and at least not think that it's because you're getting old. Even young people will feel the same impact. Maybe they're not going to be as aware of it, and they'll, bounce back maybe a little quicker, but the impact is real. And so you want to choose wisely. So for me, if I have to dance on a floor that's not my optimal floor, I might be more choosy about the tandas that I dance. Maybe I don't dance something that requires a lot of pivoting or a lot of dynamic movement. I might also be more picky about the dancers that I choose to dance with, and choose dancers that I am more in control of my experience, and I can choose when I pivot and how much. So that's all there for me to consider when I understand that the quality of the floor really, really matters. So I would say this is a very general overview of the kinds of things that I encourage you to consider. And maybe there's some other tools that you subscribe to that you might want to share. I didn't touch upon some of the things that sometimes are available at festivals, like massages, foot massages. Sometimes they'll bring little machines that can massage your feet, bringing balls with you, some sort of squishy balls to massage your feet throughout the night. Like, those kinds of things help. Although, for me, this has been an experience that if I get off the floor and I lie down for a massage, I don't want to get up afterwards. So I've just sort of, I'm the kind of person, like, once I get going, I don't stop until I stop. And to that end, just today I saw a post on Facebook that somebody said, why don't we have an all-day Milonga rather than an all-night Milonga? And we have a Milonga that starts, a marathon Milonga that starts at 2 p.m. and goes till midnight, versus, an all-nighter. And I was like, yeah, that actually would be great. And this did happen at an event last year where, for different reasons, the Sunday afternoon Milonga extended straight into the evening Milonga with no break. And so I ended up dancing from 3 o'clock in the afternoon until 2 a.m. And I had the best time. My body felt great. There was something about just being able to start and keep going until I stopped, and not having that break, not getting off the dance floor to refresh myself, but just like continuing. And then once I stopped, I just stopped, So those, hypothetical Milongas, I hope they happen. I would love to experience that and see how that works. But I hope that this kind of helps you to come up with some of your own strategies to make sure that you have the longevity and get what you want out of the events. I didn't talk much about recovery from a marathon. I think that if you go into the marathon with a lot of intentionality and care, then your recovery from a marathon will reflect that. And definitely for me, if I go into a marathon without thinking and considering those things, after the marathon, there's sort of a crash that happens, and there's a few days of just being sort of down and out. But I think you get the idea, and so I would love to just leave it at that for now and offer you the opportunity to reach out to me and tell me what you think about that, the protocol that I'm offering, and maybe you have some things to add to that protocol. I would love to hear your ideas. And of course, as always, my standing invitation to join my Facebook group, where we get to discuss things like this on a regular basis throughout the week. So the link to that is in the show notes below. Thanks so much for joining me today, and I'll see you at the next Tango Mentor next week. Ciao.